All right, engineers, in this video we're going to talk about respiration at high altitudes. Why is this such a big deal? Because, when you're at high altitudes, for example, if you decide to go and hike Mount McKinley or Mount Everest, there can be some dangerous things that can happen if you go to high altitudes very, very quickly and very fast. It can be very deadly. So what we're going to talk about is how our respiration changes during the actual ascent during the high altitudes. Okay? So let's go ahead and start there. So first thing that we need to understand about being at high altitudes is what the actual atmospheric pressure, when you talk about the atmospheric pressure, generally, atmospheric pressure or barometric pressure is approximately 760 millimeters of mercury. And out of that 760 millimeters of mercury, it's a mixture of many different gases like nitrogen and water vapor and oxygen and CO2. Well, what we're talking about here is oxygen, because at high altitudes, the availability of oxygen decreases. Why? So as you go higher, the percentage of oxygen out of this pressure decreases. So normally the partial pressure of oxygen is 21% of this. So if you take 21% of 760 millimeters of mercury, it'll give you approximately 160 millimeters of mercury, about, right? Now, what's the problem? How is this such a big deal, right? Well, when you ascend to high altitudes, the availability of oxygen decreases. So the percentage of oxygen within the atmosphere decreases. So then the partial pressure of oxygen within the atmosphere decreases. So now let's look. If it's less than 21%, this new partial pressure of oxygen is going to be less than 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Now you might say, okay, why is that such a big deal? We're going to see here in just a second. Let's say here I have the lung, right? And in the lung, it's made up of many, many, many different alveoli. Okay? We're going to treat this whole space in here as an alveoli. Okay? We're going to treat this whole space in here. So now, let's say that the partial pressure of oxygen normally within the lungs, normally at normal sea level, is approximately about 104, we're going to keep it at average about 100 millimeters of mercury. So normally, the partial pressure of oxygen within the alveoli is approximately 100, we'll write it down, 104 millimeters of mercury. That's approximately, right? But that's whenever it's at 760 and the percent of oxygen is 21%. If the percent of oxygen decreases and it goes below 21%, now there's going to be disastrous effects. Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, I don't get it. I thought, Zach, remember in the videos you said that air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure until equilibrium is reached. Well, if that's 160 out in the atmosphere, and this is 104 here in the alveoli, that doesn't make any sense. Shouldn't it be 106? Yeah, it should, but guess what happens? As oxygen is coming down into the actual lungs, it mixes with some water vapor. And as it mixes with some of the water vapor, some of the oxygen actually gets lost in that process. So the amount of oxygen that's actually coming down is only 104. So you actually, whenever it combines with some of the water vapor as it's moving down, you actually lose some of that oxygen. And then it becomes 104 millimeters of mercury. So if it actually drops, if the partial pressure of oxygen within the atmosphere when you go to high altitudes drops below than 160, what's going to happen to the partial pressure in the alveoli? It's going to drop below 104 significantly. So for example, let's say it dropped down to like 130. Okay? So the partial pressure of oxygen within the atmosphere dropped down to 130. Then the partial pressure of oxygen within the alveoli is going to drop down significantly. Let's suppose, though, for this actual video, we're going to suppose that the partial pressure of oxygen is in the atmosphere is so low that it causes the partial pressure in the alveoli to drop down to approximately 60 millimeters of mercury. Okay? So we're going to assume that the partial pressure of oxygen within the altitude and the atmospheres, whenever you're going to high altitudes, is so low, so less than 160, that whenever it moves into the alveoli, it actually becomes about 60 millimeters of mercury. Let's suppose that. Why is that a problem? Okay. So remember the structures that we had within inside of the actual, specifically the medulla and the pons? You guys remember that? Real quickly, what do we have? This was the VRG. Right, ventral respiratory group consisting of complex of neurons, clusters of neurons. This was the DRG. This was your central chemoreceptors. This was your apneustic center. And this was the pneumotaxic center. And both of these were making up your pontine respiratory group, right? So both of these pneumotaxic center and the apnoistic center collectively are making up your pontine respiratory group. So pontine respiratory group. All right, cool. Well, now, if you guys remember, the VRD and the DRG had very specific inspiratory neurons, right? Those inspiratory neurons were doing what? Well, they could send down, let's actually do this in an orange. They would send down these actual fibers, right? They were sending down these actual descending axons. And these descending axons were coming out and stimulating specific actual, what? Cell bodies here, right? The somatic motor neurons within the ventral gray horn. And what were they doing? They were coming out and collectively forming the actual neurons that were going to supply the external intercostals, and that were also going to supply the, what? Diaphragm. And again, if it was the diaphragm, it was actually going to be via the phrenic nerve. And if it was going to be through the external intercostals, it would be the intercostal nerves. And if it was the intercostal nerves, that was at T1 to T11, phrenic nerve is C3 to C5, right? Okay, well, this is the normal way. If you guys remember from the video when we talked about the control and the regulation of respiration, we talked about what happens whenever the partial pressure of oxygen is really low. All right, so now let's take this guy over here and let's see what's going to happen, because this should make sense now. Okay, partial pressure of oxygen within the alveoli. We're going to treat this as the alveoli. The partial pressure of oxygen within the alveoli now, when we're at high altitudes, is so low that it drops to 60 millimeters of mercury. All right, sweet deal. But then, let's say, as the blood is coming through, what is this? Here's your right side of the heart, right? So this is your right atrium. This is your right ventricle. This is the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. So we'll put PA, pulmonary arteries. And then coming out over here, what are these going to be? These over here are going to be your pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins, okay? As the blood is flowing through the pulmonary artery, what is the pressure? What is the partial pressure of oxygen? So the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood is approximately 40 millimeters of mercury, right? And if you guys remember from before, air will flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure until there's equilibrium reached, right? So what's going to happen then? Oxygen is going to flow from the alveoli into the blood. What is that called? External respiration, right? So where's the actual blood going to flow? I'm sorry, the oxygen going to flow. The oxygen is going to flow here into the actual pulmonary capillaries and exchange this process with the oxygen. So what should oxygen come out as? It should leave and go into the pulmonary veins as having a partial pressure of oxygen equal to 60 millimeters of mercury. Okay. What about CO2? Well, right now we'll talk about CO2 for a second here. The partial pressure of CO2 normally within this blood is going to be approximately about 45 to 46 millimeters of mercury. Whereas in the alveoli, the partial pressure of CO2 is only what? Let's do this in a different color. Let's do this in the brown also. So the partial pressure of CO2 within the alveoli is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So it's approximately 40 millimeters of mercury. But we'll see how that changes during this process. So again, where would the air want to flow? The air would want to flow from areas of high pressure to low pressure. So where is this going to go? It's going to go out. It's going to come out here into the alveoli. And it's going to move from the blood into the alveoli until the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood is going to equilibrate with the partial pressure of CO2 within the alveoli. So what should it leave as? The partial pressure of CO2 as it leaves should be equal to 40 millimeters of mercury. So that's what it should be. So the partial pressure of CO2 should be equal to 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Because if you get this, it's going to make so much sense here. Watch this. The problem is they're having hypoxemia, right? What do we define as a hypoxemia? It was basically whenever you have this low arterial partial pressure of oxygen. What did we say whenever the partial pressure of oxygen is equal to 60 or less than 60 millimeters of mercury, what chemoreceptors are getting activated? The peripheral chemoreceptors. So look at this. The partial pressure of oxygen is so low, so what is it going to do? It's going to come up here, it's going to go back to where? It's going to go from the pulmonary veins, it's going to go into the right atrium, then it's going to go into the, I'm sorry, not right atrium, this should be left atrium, shame on me. This should be left atrium, and this should be left ventricle, goes up into the aorta. As it goes up into the aorta, it runs up through, again, it can come up actually eventually to the common carotid artery. So this is the common carotid artery, common carotid artery. This is the external carotid artery. This is the internal carotid artery. Again, internal carotid artery, external carotid artery, subclavian artery, subclavian artery. You get the point, right? And this would be the right side, that would be the left side. As you go up, around this point where the common carotid artery bifurcates and goes to the external carotid artery and internal carotid artery, there's these little bodies. What are these little dudes up here, these little smiling dudes called? Remember those? Those are your peripheral chemoreceptors. And these peripheral chemoreceptors are special. So again, what are these structures here called? They're called peripheral chemoreceptors. And again, if they're here located within the actual carotid bifurcation point, they're called the carotid bodies. So these are called your carotid bodies. And if they're located here at the aortic arch, they're going to be called the aortic bodies. And if you guys remember, these are responding to a low partial pressure of oxygen whenever it's below 60 millimeters of mercury. So let's assume that it actually is going below 60 millimeters of mercury. Is that at least 60 or below? What is it going to do? It's going to stimulate these guys. You guys already know the mechanism. It inhibits those potassium channels, and then calcium comes in, dopamine's released. What happens to these guys then? If this low partial pressure of oxygen stimulates these guys, they're going to activate their actual sensory afferent fibers of those two cranial nerves. What were the cranial nerves that were being activated in this process? If you guys remember, it was actually if it was connected to this one. If it was connected to the aortic bodies, it's going to be cranial nerve, what? 10, which is the vagus nerve. If it was connected with the actual carotid bodies, it was going to be cranial nerve 9, which was the glossopharyngeal nerve. If they're stimulated, what are they going to do? They're going to send signals. What are they going to send signals with? So down, if we follow, let's say that we follow the cranial nerve 10 and cranial nerve 9. As they send signals over, let's say that we follow the signal like this now. Here's the signal. And again, who's carrying this signal? It's going to be cranial nerve 10. All right, and this is going to be cranial nerve 9. And again, what was cranial nerve 10 and 9? This was glossopharyngeal. This is the vagus. They're sending centers to the respiratory centers within the medulla and within the pons. What was the overall result, if you guys remember? Well, the stimulation was what? Let's remember what the stimulation was. It was low partial pressure of oxygen. And it has to be at least 60 millimeters of mercury or less. It is in this case. Let's assume that it is in this case. What is it going to do? It's going to stimulate specific centers within the medulla, right? What are those two centers? One is it's going to activate the DRG. The other one is it's going to activate the VRG. But specifically, what action of these two guys? So if we follow these guys in here, what are they going to do? Stimulate the VRG, and it's also going to stimulate the DRG. And it's going to activate having more frequency of action potentials. So what's going to happen to the frequency of action potentials? The frequency of action potentials is going to go up. If the frequency of the action potentials go up, what's going to happen to the diaphragm muscle? It's going to be stimulated heavily and frequently. And then the external intercostal is going to be stimulated frequently and heavily. What's going to happen to these individuals? They're going to hyperventilate. Because if you're actually having increased frequency of contraction, increased frequency of action potentials, increased frequency of contractions, what's going to happen to this person? They're going to have increased alveolar ventilation. What does that mean? That means that you're going to increase the respiration rate and increase the actual depth. So you're going to increase the respiration rate and the depth. In other words, the tidal volume, in this case for the depth, right? We could put that below, the tidal volume. We can try to increase that. If you do that, what's going to happen then? If you increase your alveolar ventilation as you're going to high altitudes, your alveolar ventilation rate is going to increase originally as you're going up to these high altitudes. What's that going to try to do then? It's going to try to increase the ventilation process. So it's going to try to bring more air in from the atmosphere to the best of its ability. So as you try to bring more air in to the best of your ability from the atmosphere, it's going to attempt to increase the ventilation process. What does that mean then? It's going to try to increase the actual exchange of oxygen with the blood, but it might not change significantly. Let's say that it actually goes up a little bit and it goes up to about, let's say 75 or 80, whatever. It goes up to about 75 or 80. Where's my brown marker? There it is. So let's say it goes up to about 80 millimeters of mercury, okay? If that's the case, then what's going to happen to the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood after the exchange occurs? It should go up to about 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay, that's good. What happens to the stimulus now for the actual aortic bodies? It goes away. What happens to the stimulus for the actual carotid bodies? It goes away, right? And then we basically inhibit the action potentials that are going to the diaphragm, the external intercostals, as we increase the ventilation process to appropriate values. So as we try to, in other words, until we bring the partial pressure of oxygen below 60 millimeters of mercury to the best of our abilities above that, then the hyperventilation or the increase in ventilation and depth rate is also going to slow down. But there's a problem in this. Something happens that's not good. Remember I told you CO2 was moving also? And we know that it normally moves from 45 to 40. Well, guess what happens? As you move to higher altitudes, you know what happens within the atmosphere? The concentration, the partial pressure of CO2 within the atmosphere, it also decreases slightly. So let's say now that the partial pressure of CO2 within the atmosphere decreases slightly. So let's say that now the partial pressure of CO2 decreases slightly. So let's say that it drops down to about, let's say it's actually 25 millimeters of mercury, whatever, we pick a number there, 25 millimeters of mercury. If that's the case then, what's the partial pressure of CO2 within the alveoli going to be? It's going to be a lot less. So let's assume that it's so low that it actually drops to about 25 millimeters of mercury, let's suppose. Okay? If that's the case, then what's going to happen to the movement of CO2? Well, before it was 45 to 40. Now it's 45 to 25. That's a 20 gradient difference right there, right? As compared to just a 5 gradient difference. That means more CO2 than normal is going to be being exhaled out. As you try to exhale out more CO2, what happens to the CO2 partial pressure within the blood? It drops. It drops until these two pressures equilibrate. What's the partial pressure of CO2 going to be now? The partial pressure of CO2 is going to be 25 millimeters of mercury. Oh my goodness, this is really, really bad. Why is this really, really bad? Let me explain to you why it's really bad. Because if the partial pressure of CO2 is really, really low, what can that do? Let's come over here and see what happens to the brain. This is not a good thing. Not a good thing. Okay, so now we said that the partial pressure of CO2 is extremely low now because the atmosphere is low in CO2. So now the partial pressure of CO2 within the alveoli was 25. And in other words, whenever there's an exchange across the pulmonary capillaries, the partial pressure of CO2 within the arterial blood becomes 25 millimeters of mercury. That means that CO2 that's actually coming into the cerebrospinal fluid, when it crosses, what was this called here? The blood-brain barrier. When it crosses the blood-brain barrier and it combines with water, if these two combine in the presence of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, it'll form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into what? Bicarbonate, and it also dissociates into protons. This arrow should be this way too. And then what happens with these protons? These protons are normally trying to act on the central chemoreceptors. But what did we say was the problem? The CO2 is low. The carbonic acid's low. The H plus is low. What do we say happens if it's really, really low? It's not stimulating the actual central chemoreceptors. In other words, it starts inhibiting it. If this inhibits the central chemoreceptors, what does it do to the DRG? It inhibits the DRG. If the DRG is inhibited, what does it do to the actual VRG? It inhibits it. What happens then to these action potentials that are going down to the phrenic nerve and to the actual external intercostals? It's actually going to be decreasing in frequency. So what happens to the frequency then? The frequency decreases. As the frequency decreases, then what happens? The alveolar ventilation decreases. As the alveolar ventilation decreases, what happens to the rate and the depth? It also decreases. And then what happens over here, right? You're going to have very, very slow breathing. And that's a problem now because originally, what was happening? You had hypoxemia, right? Now if you have slow breathing, are you going to be able to allow for enough oxygen to keep coming in from the atmosphere? No. That is a bad thing, and we'll talk about why, because it can lead to acute mountain sickness. So again, whenever this happens, your drive originally was hypoxemia, and then you're trying to hyperventilate to compensate for the hypoxemia. But as you try to compensate, what are you doing? You're breathing off a lot of CO2. As you start breathing off a lot of CO2, what happens? You go into a situation where so much CO2 is lost that it can produce a condition called respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis. And basically that's when you have extreme, your pH is really high. So your pH is higher than normal, but this pH is high due to low CO2 levels, okay? That's the actual stimulus, and it's because you're breathing off a lot of CO2 because the actual CO2 within the atmosphere is a little bit lower than normal. So we changed the number. We said it was about 25 now, okay? I could have picked on any other number. I just picked 25 just for that, okay? There was no rhyme or reason. Okay, so again, respiratory alkalosis can be produced in this situation, which is extremely dangerous because now what did you do? You took away the stimulus for this hyperventilation. So now there's two things that are trying to be able to work here. What are the two things that are trying to work? How is this produced? So whenever there was this low partial pressure of oxygen, this was trying to increase ventilation, right? But then as you increase the ventilation, you bring the partial pressure of oxygen back up. Let's assume that you bring it back up to normal. Okay? But in that process, as you increase your ventilation, what did you do to the partial pressure of CO2? You decrease the partial pressure of CO2 very, very low. What does that do to the actual action on the central chemoreceptors? It inhibits the central chemoreceptors. If you inhibit the central chemoreceptors, then what's going to happen to the ventilation? You're going to decrease the ventilation. So if you see what I'm saying here, it's basically you're having an opposed action. So there is ventilation occurring, it's just not as high as you would want it to be. It's very moderate instead of excessive to be able to get as much oxygen to the tissues as possible. And that's why it's dangerous. How does our body deal with this though? Okay, well let's say that you're a good hiker, you've done this before. As you're ascending, you decide, all right, I'm gonna take a couple days, I'm gonna stay here, I'm gonna wait, and I'm gonna let my body acclimatize, okay? I'm gonna try to acclimate to these actual conditions. How does the body acclimate to the conditions? We gotta go to the kidney and see. So now let's see what the kidney, what our good old kidney does for us, all right? In our kidney, you have, this is actually, if you guys have watched it, you know that this is the proximal convoluted tubule, this is the actual loop of Henle, the ascending and the descending. This is the distal convoluted tubule, and then this right here that we're looking at is the collecting duct. Collecting duct. Okay, now, there is these two types of cells present within our kidneys. They're called intercalated cells, and they basically are playing a role with our acid-base balance. But there's one particular type. There's A and B cells. We're going to look at the intercalated B cells. And don't get these confused with the B cells within your immune system. This is the actual cells in the kidney, okay? Now, what happens with these intercalated B cells? Well, if you guys remember, we can actually bring CO2 in, right? So let's say here's our CO2, and the CO2 comes in here. You know that the CO2 is going to combine with the water. When these two combine in the presence of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, what happens? It gets converted into carbonic acid, which breaks down and dissociates into protons and bicarbonate. You know what our body does? It says, okay, let's assume that right here I put a blood vessel. Well, actually, let's just put it right here. Even though it's a vein, it's for the purpose of understanding this, okay? Here's two options. He says, okay, the pH over here in the blood is really high. Okay, what could I do? Well, let me actually not put bicarbonate, because normally what you can do is you can bring bicarbonate into the bloodstream, right? But we don't want to do that. We want to get rid of the bicarbonate. So look what it does. It's very tricky, and it pumps the actual protons out here. And you have to use ATP for this process, right? So in order for you to do this, you have to utilize ATP and other different types of ions. So you're pumping the protons out into the blood. But then what are you going to do with the bicarbonate? You're going to excrete out the bicarbonate in the urine. So as you start excreting out bicarbonate within the urine, you're losing a lot of your bicarbonate and bringing protons into the blood. What happens to the pH, guys? The pH starts going back down to at least normal values. Oh, that's so freaking cool. All right, so that's how our body's helping to deal with this. So if you stay at that high altitude for a couple days, maybe even a week if you really want to be completely acclimatized, right? Basically what's happening, your kidneys, your intercalated B cells are coming to the rescue, and they're putting protons back into the blood, which is bringing the pH down, and we'll see how that helps in just a second. And then it's getting rid of the bicarbonate. Okay, how is this fixing it? Because you might be like, what that mean, man? I got you, don't worry. All right, so look, we said that there was going to be a lot more protons. If there's a little bit more protons here, and there's less bicarbonate. So look, we got rid of a lot of this bicarbonate. If you decrease a lot of this bicarbonate right here, it's not going to be able to bind with as many of these protons, because you know that this is basically a buffer here. Carbonic acid can break down into two things. It can break down into H plus and bicarb. This is basically your buffer. But according to a guy named Le Chatelier, he came up with this concept that he says if you decrease this side, right, then what's going to happen? You're not going to have as much of this guy over here. So what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to break down, you're going to want to shift the reaction to the right. So you're going to want to have more carbonic acid break down into protons and bicarb. So as you do that, what are you accumulating more of? You're accumulating more protons. Also, you're going to have a little bit more protons accumulating within the blood too. But the protons can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So the main thing to remember is that you're excreting bicarbonate. And as you get rid of bicarbonate, bicarbonate ions decreases. Le Chatelier's principle, let's see if I can spell this. Le Chatelier's principle is basically saying that as you decrease this side of the reaction, decrease the bicarb, the reaction is going to want to shift to the right. As it shifts to the right, you make more protons. More protons are going to do what to the central chemoreceptors? Stimulate them. If you stimulate them, you're going to stimulate the DRG. If you stimulate the DRG, you stimulate the VRG. If you stimulate the VRG, you have more action potentials coming down. If you have more action potentials coming down, you're going to frequency of the actual ventilation is going to, our action potentials is going to increase. You're going to have more frequent contractions. If you have more frequent contractions, oh my goodness, you guys should get this already, right? There's going to be an increase in ventilation rate. There's going to be an increase in the depth and the actual, in this case, the tidal volume. And then what's going to happen? You're going to have this action here where you can go back into this hyperventilatory state and do what? Try to bring more oxygen back into the bloodstream and exhale some more of the CO2. Okay, but you do it to a level that's accommodating, it's acceptable, right? You're not in the situation to where you're in respiratory alkalosis or you're not having excessive hypoxemia. So that's an amazing thing, but unfortunately, it's not enough. Unfortunately, it's not enough. So how else could you deal with this? Well, the body has another way of dealing with it. It's really cool. All right, so let's say here, your kidneys come to the rescue again. If you guys remember, we said, if you guys watched the actual videos within hematology, we talked about the proximal convoluted tubule. And if you guys remember, the proximal convoluted tubule was responsible for secreting a special hormone. Remember there was the hypoxia inducible factor who was bound by that little enzyme there? And we said that whenever there was low oxygen, so in this case we should be specific, we should say low partial pressure of oxygen, right? Because the partial pressure of oxygen is still going to be low. It's never going to be at 100 whenever you're going to high altitudes. So your body has to compensate. Whenever there's low oxygen, you can't hydroxylate this enzyme here. So this enzyme is inhibited. And what happens to the hypoxia inducible factor? It comes and it activates specific genes. And when it activates specific genes, it produces a hormone. What was that hormone, if you guys remember? That hormone was called EPO, erythropoietin. All right? What is erythropoietin going to do? Erythropoietin is so cool because it comes over here to the bone marrow. What's within our red bone marrow? Do you guys remember that we have the red bone marrow within the epiphyses of the long bones within that spongy bone, right? It's going to stimulate the bone marrow to start producing more red blood cells, right? Because if you remember, let's say that we draw in here, what do we have? We had a pluripotent stem cell that can divide into a myeloid and a lymphoid stem cell. And then the myeloid stem cell can actually go to develop, eventually, red blood cells. Or it can go to make platelets and white blood cells, certain white blood cells. EPO, if you guys remember, it was stimulating the actual formation of more red blood cells. If you have more red blood cells, what does that mean then? If I have more red blood cells, I have more hemoglobin. If I have more hemoglobin, I can carry more oxygen. So what's going to happen to the oxygen carrying capacity? It's going to increase. What is that called, though, whenever you make a lot of red blood cells? Polycythemia. So in these individuals, what are you going to see with them? Not only are you going to see that they have elevated erythropoietin levels, they're going to have very high erythropoietin levels, but they're also going to make a lot of red blood cells. And whenever you make an excessive amount of red blood cells, that's called polycythemia. Okay, so they're also going to have polycythemia. Okay, so they have polycythemia, increased ventilation, increased erythropoietin production. Wow, they have a lot of things going on. Unfortunately, that's still not it. Okay, look what else is happening here. So again, we said increase. So what was the things that we said so far? So far we've said There's been an increase in ventilation. The second thing we said that there was an actual increase in the number of red blood cells, which is called polycythemia. Polycythemia. Now for the third thing. Okay. Well, if you guys remember, we're trying to increase the ventilation, right? That's what we're attempting to do. So if you guys think about the alveoli like this, let's say here I draw a small alveoli, right? Here's the alveoli. And then here's a small little capillary. Let's have a small little capillary coming around it, right? Okay. Right now, what have we done? We've increased the number of red blood cells, right? We've increased the number of red blood cells. So there's more red blood cells. What does that mean for the actual amount of blood that's coming through here then? There's actually going to be more blood flow, so more perfusion coming through here, right? There's a lot more red blood cells that you can oxygenate. What else are we trying to do? We're trying to increase the ventilation. Well, as you try to increase the ventilation and you increase the perfusion, isn't that one of the most efficient ways to have good ventilation-perfusion coupling? Right? Because what did we say? That ventilation over perfusion, V over Q, is equal to 0.8. If you increase the ventilation, you want to couple it. So how would you do that? Because if you increase this, it would increase this number. You're going to want to increase the perfusion, because if you increase the perfusion, you decrease this number. So you help it come back to normal range. So there's good ventilation-perfusion coupling, which means what? There's efficient gas exchange. Efficient gas exchange means that you're going to have a very efficient movement of oxygen from the alveoli to the blood and a good movement of CO2 from the blood to the alveoli. That's amazing too. Oh my goodness, it's so cool. So again, increased ventilation, increased number of red blood cells due to polycythemia, and because of that, there's adequate, or we should say normal VQ coupling, which means that there's efficient gas exchange. All right, sweet deal. One more. This is kind of the one that happens if you are at high altitudes for a little bit of a longer time period. So if you're at high altitudes for a little bit longer than normal, your body does something absolutely amazing. Okay. Let's say here's these tissues. And what's happening with some of these tissues? We said that normally whenever you're at high altitudes, you're developing hypoxemia, right? So there's not a lot of oxygen delivery normally to these tissues because of the low partial pressure of oxygen. And again, this is due to the hypoxemia due to being at high altitudes. So you're not getting a lot of delivery to the oxygen tissues. You're not getting a lot of oxygen delivery to the tissues. So how does your body deal with this? Okay. Inside of your blood vessels, you have these actual endothelial cells here. All right, here's your endothelial cells. These endothelial cells and other different tissue cells within the vicinity, other different tissue cells, start producing very amazing chemicals. One of the chemicals is called vascular endothelial growth factor. And what is this vascular endothelial growth factor? So there's that, and then there's platelet-derived growth factors. There's a lot of growth factors that are released. What is this basically going to do? It's pretty sweet. Look at this. Let's say that it secretes this, and you actually sprout another blood vessel. So coming off of this, I'm going to have another blood vessel. It also, let's say it stimulates over here. I'm going to have more blood vessels. Let's say I sprout off of this one. I'm going to have more blood vessels. Sprout off of this one. More blood vessels. You guys get the point. What am I doing? I'm making more blood vessels to accommodate for this actual situation in which there's a decreased oxygen delivery. What is that called whenever you're making new blood vessels? It's called angiogenesis. So they're going to have a heavy capillary density. So because of this, increased vascular endothelial growth factor, or platelet-derived growth factors, all these different types of growth factor chemicals, what are they going to do? They're going to trigger the production of more blood vessels. This is called angiogenesis. Okay? And if they have more blood vessels, what does that mean then? They have more routes to deliver oxygen to other tissues. So it's going to increase the oxygen carrying capacity and delivery to the tissues to accommodate for that decrease in oxygen levels. Okay, so that was the last thing. So the last thing was angiogenesis, making more blood vessels. But this is really long term. So this is if you stay up at high altitudes for a little bit longer than normal, right? Another thing is if you stay up at high altitudes for a long period of time, it can actually change your whole, like if you're actually born at high altitudes, it can actually change your whole structural chest wall. Usually people who are born at high altitudes, they have like a barrel-shaped chest. They have a barrel-shaped chest and they have a very, very strong right ventricle. And the reason why is they have to pump a lot of blood to different parts of the lungs and make sure that it's getting adequately oxygenated. Okay, now that we talked about all these things, I want to say what can happen whenever you actually don't properly ascend during going to high altitudes. You just decide, all right, I'm going to go full blast. I'm going to blaze up that sucker. Why is this bad? As you do this and you don't acclimate. Okay, so what is this process called? Whenever you stay at these high altitudes for a while to allow for your body to compensate and acclimatize, it's called acclimatization, right? So acclimatization. Sorry guys, I'm not the best speller. So acclimatization, all right? So acclimatization is going to be this, basically this time where you stay at high altitudes to be able to compensate, allow for your intercalated B cells to go to work, allow for this erythropoietin to go to work, angiogenesis, all these different things, right? Okay, now we said that whenever you're at high altitudes, what do we say? It's really, really bad because eventually, what did we say? If there's this respiratory alkalosis, we said generally what you're going to try to do, you're going to increase your ventilation to get the oxygen levels back to normal. But during that process, when you're increasing the ventilation, as you increase the ventilation and because the CO2 within the atmosphere is a little bit lower than normal, more CO2 is leaving. So the partial pressure of CO2 within the blood decreases, which inhibits the central chemoreceptors. So there's an opposing ventilation. So there's not a lot of ventilation. If that happens over a long period of time, the hypoxemia can persist for a very long time. If it does persist for a very long time, this low partial pressure of oxygen is extremely dangerous. If you watched our microcirculation video, you'll understand why. Whenever there is low partial pressure of oxygen within the systemic blood vessels, it triggers vasodilation. And whenever there is this vasodilation of the cerebral vessels, what is it going to do then? It's going to dilate. So what is this called? Vasodilation. As there's vasodilation, what happens to the amount of blood flowing through here then? There's going to be more blood flowing through. If more blood is flowing through the cerebral vessels, what does that mean then? That means that more fluid can leak out because now we're going to have more fluid leaking out here into the actual brain tissue. If more fluid is leaking out here into the brain tissue, what is that going to do? That's going to increase a lot of fluid accumulation in the interstitial spaces. And that's going to produce a condition called cerebral edema. And this is bad, really bad, because if the edema can persist for a long period of time, or if it becomes so significant, it can actually push on the brain and try to cause the herniation of the brain. So two things can happen with this if it becomes really bad. It can increase the intracranial pressure, and one of the signs for intracranial pressure is usually you have a pounding headache. You can have a decreasing usually in this situation, your pulse rate is actually going to be decreasing, your blood pressure is actually increasing, and also you can have a lot of nausea and problems like that. And also the pupils are having a hard time being able to respond to specific light and stuff. So high intracranial pressure is extremely dangerous because it can cause herniation of the brain. Why is that dangerous? Because if the brain herniates and compresses the pontine respiratory group or the ventral respiratory group or DRG, what's going to happen to the neural impulses? They're going to cease. Will you be able to breathe? No, you'll go into respiratory arrest and respiratory failure, right? So that's what's extremely dangerous. So again, if this actual partial pressure of oxygen persists for a long period of time, it can become dangerous, dilate the blood vessels, go into the actual cerebrum, cause more fluid to leak out, cause cerebral edema, increase the intracranial pressure, and cause the herniation of the brain, which can damage some of the actual respiratory centers within the brainstem. That's why when people go to these high altitudes, you make sure, I actually asked one of my friends, he hiked Mount McKinley, and he said that whenever he went to high altitudes, he took a couple different types of medicine, okay, certain drugs. So one of them is actually called a Citas Olamide. Citas Olamide. And basically what a Citas Olamide does is, you remember this enzyme here, this carbonic anhydrase? It inhibits this carbonic anhydrase. And if you inhibit the carbonic anhydrase, what it does is it basically helps to be able to mimic and make your body, trick your body into thinking that you actually have elevated CO2 levels. And so if that's the case, then you actually going to have these elevated CO2 levels. If you have these elevated CO2 levels, it'll increase your actual ventilation rate. So that's one thing they do, is they try to take acetazolamide. But also, the first thing that you're going to want to do if you notice someone having cerebral edema is try to get them on supplemental oxygen. So try to get them on supplemental oxygen. So oxygen. But if the actual cerebral edema is so bad, you're going to want to try to give them another drug, which is called Mannitol. And Mannitol is a large molecule, and basically what it does is it comes in here and sucks a lot of the fluid out of the actual brain. And when it pulls a lot of fluid out, it alleviates some of the cerebral edema. They also can give another drug called dexamethasone, which is basically a corticosteroid, which also, through some unknown mechanism, is able to reduce some of the actual swelling within the brain. Okay, so again, you want to make sure that you acclimatize, right? Another thing that can happen is because the partial pressure of oxygen within the lungs, if you guys remember, let's say I draw here another small alveoli, just real quickly here. If there is actually a situation in which the partial pressure of oxygen within the alveoli is very low, and let's say that there's another one, another partial pressure of oxygen that's really low. If this happens and you have blood vessels coming to this area, right? So here's a blood vessel here, and here's a blood vessel coming right here. What's going to happen? What was the normal response? Well, in the actual systemic circulation, it dilates. In the actual pulmonary circulation, it constricts. If it constricts, the actual pressure is going to increase, right? So if it constricts, you're going to actually have this pressure increase. And over time, what happens is, over time, as this pressure continues to increase in certain areas of the lung, some of the actual vessels, there's a high amount of constriction in certain vessels. So let's assume that, let's say that you have a vessel here, and a vessel here. And this one is actually going to have some smooth muscle here. This one will have some smooth muscle here, the precapillary sphincters. This one will have the precapillary sphincters here. Let's say this one has heavy constriction. So this one has heavy constriction. So not a lot of blood is going to this one. Let's say this one has heavy constriction, and not a lot of blood is going to this one. But let's say this one only has moderate constriction. The actual precapillary sphincters won't contract. And what's going to happen then? The blood that is not going to these vessels and these vessels are going to be redirected. So now it's going to be going through this one. Some of the blood will be going to this one, and some of the normal blood will be going to this one. What happens to the amount of blood flow going to this one little sucker right there? He's going to have so much blood flow that fluid is going to start leaking out. As fluid starts leaking out into the actual interstitial spaces of the respiratory membrane, what is that called? This can produce pulmonary edema, which obviously can be extremely dangerous because that can impair the gas exchange process. Okay, so now that we understand that pulmonary edema can occur and the cerebral edema can occur, these are the two basic signs of whenever someone is experiencing acute mountain sickness. Okay, so if someone has cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, how would we classify this? We would say that this individual is having acute mountain sickness. And again, how would you try to treat these people? Obviously, immediately get them away from the high altitudes, give them a Citas Olamide or Domax, give them supplemental oxygen, mannitol, dexamethasone, and make sure that you try to take care of the patient as quickly as possible. All right, engineers, so in this video we covered a lot of information about the respiration at high altitudes. I hope it all made sense. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys did, please hit the like button, subscribe, put some comments down in the comment section. As always, Ninja Nerds, until next time.